Ever find yourself just entirely drained after doom scrolling through the latest headlines? You're reading about shifting alliances, sudden military strikes, power struggles, and it's exhausting, right? The world stage right now honestly feels like one incredibly complicated, completely unresolved relationship, especially when you look at the dynamic between Washington, Jerusalem, and Tehran. So, welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to act as your geopolitical therapist. We're going to bypass all that dense diplomatic jargon, process the chaos together, and figure out the massive gap between the political rhetoric we hear and the actual reality playing out on the ground. Let's dive right in. 37. That is the exact number of times Donald Trump has publicly claimed an Iran nuclear deal was either imminent, inevitable, or that Tehran was absolutely desperate to sign one, just since February 28th. 37 times. Across social media, press calls, campaign rallies, you name it, the exact same geopolitical deadline is being sold to the public. The messaging week after week is that a historic agreement is just days away. And this repetitive framing really shapes public expectation. It makes it sound like this incredibly complex, decades-old hostility is about to be neatly wrapped up with a single signature. But as the calendar keeps turning, well, the contrast between those guarantees and the lack of an actual deal is getting pretty impossible to ignore. All right, here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with the promise of soon, then look at Iran's cautious approach, track the key negotiation milestones, dissect what some are calling a lover's spat, and finish up by looking at their fracturing goals. Section 1. The promise of soon, or as I like to call it, a geopolitical software update permanently stuck at 90%. So, the rhetoric coming out of Washington right now paints a picture of total, unquestioned control. Trump is confidently doubling down, throwing out a really tight 2-week timeline for what he calls total victory over Iran. And alongside this super brief timeline, he's projecting that global oil prices are going to fall sharply as a direct result. Plus, he's insisting that the U.S. economic blockade on Tehran is holding at exactly 100%. The claim is that absolutely nothing is getting through. No oil exports, no income, effectively cutting off the country's financial lifeblood. Now, while the exact definition of total victory isn't fully spelled out here, the delivery is just incredibly confident. It's the casual assurance of someone who firmly believes this deal is literally sitting at the finish line. Moving right along to Section 2, Iran's cautious approach. 1 foot in, 1 foot out. To really understand why that 2-week timeline might be, let's say, a bit optimistic, we have to look at Tehran's side of the board. And we get a very telling answer from Ibrahim Azizi, a senior official in Iran's national security apparatus. He says that Iran has no problem with negotiations, but only if it can trust that America is genuinely interested in talking and not just buying time. This hits the nail on the head regarding the deep historical trust deficit here. It's definitely not a warm diplomatic embrace, but hey, it's not a total rejection either. Tehran is playing a very calculated game, keeping 1 foot in the talks and 1 foot out. They're keeping enough ambiguity to hold on to their leverage, all while keeping any major military retaliation paused for now. They're basically waiting to see if these back-channel talks actually bring economic relief or just more empty promises. Which brings us to Section 3, Key Negotiation Milestones. It is time for a chronological reality check. Because look, if a peace deal has perpetually been 2 weeks away since late February, we really need to track what's actually happening on the ground. So, following those early promises, an official ceasefire did successfully kick in on April 8th. We got a brief window of stability. But that fragile pause completely shattered recently when Israel launched a targeted strike in Beirut aimed at Hezbollah, Tehran's primary proxy and forward deterrent. That strike fundamentally changed the math. Almost immediately, Israel and Iran were directly trading military fire for the first time since that April ceasefire. So instead of a neat diplomatic resolution, the region was thrown right back into a kinetic, volatile confrontation. In fact, it got so heated it required direct intervention from the top of the US government to pull everyone back from the brink. Let's actually break down the anatomy of this recent escalation, because it was a rapid-fire sequence. Step 1, Israel strikes Beirut. Step 2, Iran feels its deterrence is threatened and fires back. Step 3, Israel launches limited proportional strikes on Iranian assets, firmly citing self-defense and signaling they are ready to escalate. And then, Step 4. This is the crucial part. It wasn't some pre-existing diplomatic framework that stopped this cycle. The escalation halted because Donald Trump reportedly stepped in and directly contacted Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. The US leader literally had to force an allied nation to pause its plans for a broader wave of military attacks just to keep his negotiation timeline alive. Let's look closer at that friction in Section 4, the lover's spat. Rhetoric versus reality behind closed doors. According to Axios, who reported on that pivotal phone call, this was not a polite diplomatic suggestion. Trump delivered a super blunt, incredibly forceful warning to Netanyahu. He reportedly said, "Bibi, you better be careful or you will be on your own very soon." The implication there is crystal clear, right? If Israel chose to unilaterally expand this war, they'd be doing it without US backing. Sources say this actually turned into a highly contentious, expletive-laden exchange. It really shows a boiling frustration from Washington over allied military operations that they feel are directly sabotaging their ultimate goal of signing a peace deal. And this friction isn't just happening in leaked, behind closed doors phone calls anymore. JD Vance recently went on Fox News and just openly stated the quiet part out loud. He candidly said the United States and Israel don't always want the same things. I mean, that is a stark, public admission of divergent interests right in the middle of an active conflict. Washington wants regional stability, no wider U.S. military entanglement, and a massive foreign policy win. Jerusalem, on the other hand, is focused on neutralizing existential threats on its borders and dismantling proxy networks, regardless of how it impacts their allies' diplomatic schedule. But if you ask the Israeli ambassador to Washington, you get a much softer spin. When pressed about these deep tensions, the ultimatums, the diverging goals, he downplayed the whole thing, calling it a lover spat. The official line is essentially, look, Trump and Netanyahu have a 40-year friendship. When you're managing a long-term alliance dealing with high-stakes security, the room is occasionally going to get a little heated. No big deal. But is it just a spat? Let's hit our final section. Section 5, fracturing goals. The incompatible hardware in the partnership. When you place their immediate objectives side by side, the divide is literally staring right at us. On the left, Trump's goals: cut the region's losses, sign a sweeping deal, declare a massive victory, and pivot America's focus elsewhere. He wants resolution. On the right, Netanyahu's goals: sustained or even increased military pressure to permanently degrade Iran's nuclear infrastructure and dismantle its proxies. He wants degradation. This is not a unified partnership working toward a shared endgame. At this stage of the conflict, their foundational goals are just fundamentally incompatible. They are playing two completely different games on the exact same board. Which circles us all the way back to those 37 distinct promises. Washington keeps saying an enduring peace is just around the corner. But we're tracking the data here, and we're over 100 days into this specific phase of the conflict. For a deal that has been perpetually 2 weeks away since February, that corner definitely deserves its own zip code by now. The rhetoric of soon has slammed into the rigid, messy reality of Middle Eastern geopolitics. Soon isn't a timeline anymore. It's a permanent holding pattern where deadlines just go to retire. So, I'm going to leave you with this final thought to chew on as these events keep unfolding. As this strategic partnership shows visible fractures and that geopolitical software update stays stubbornly stuck at 90%, will the physical reality on the ground ever actually catch up to the endless promise of soon? Until the deeply differing motives of these countries actually align, can we truly expect this chaotic cycle of conflict and paused deadlines to ever finish downloading? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. And remember, always keep your eyes sharply focused on the reality hiding behind the rhetoric.